In the summer of 1858, London became uninhabitable in a way that defied the imagination of even its most hardened residents. The city had endured plague, fire, and fog, but nothing had prepared its inhabitants for the assault that came not from disease or flame, but from the very river that had given the metropolis life. The Thames, that ancient waterway which had carried Viking longships and Roman galleys, which had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, chose that blazing summer to exact its revenge upon the city that had poisoned it. The heat arrived early that year, settling over London like a thick woolen blanket in May and refusing to lift through June, July, and into August. Day after day, the sun beat down upon the cobblestones and brick facades, turning the city into a vast oven. But it was not the heat alone that drove members of Parliament from their chambers, that sent gentlemen fleeing from their clubs, that caused ladies to faint in the streets. It was the smell. To call it merely a smell would be to diminish its power, to reduce a catastrophe to a mere inconvenience. This was an olfactory assault of such magnitude that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down upon the city with malevolent intent. It rose from the Thames in visible waves, a miasma that could be seen shimmering in the summer air. Those who lived through it struggled for decades afterward to find words adequate to describe it. Some compared it to rotting meat left in the sun for weeks. Others spoke of cesspools multiplied 1,000-fold. Still others gave up entirely, saying simply that it was the smell of death itself, concentrated and unleashed upon the living. The river that produced this abomination bore little resemblance to the Thames of earlier centuries, where once the water had run clear enough to support salmon and other fish, where Tudor monarchs had travelled in gilded barges and merchants had drawn drinking water from its depths. There now flowed something that could barely be called water at all. It was a thick, brown sludge, its surface occasionally broken by bubbles of gas that burst with sulphurous pops. In some places, particularly near the outfalls of the city's sewers, the consistency approached that of porridge. Dead dogs floated past the Houses of Parliament. Rats, overcome by the very filth they usually thrived in, washed up on the embankments in their hundreds. The transformation of the Thames from life-giving artery to open sewer had been centuries in the making, but it had accelerated dramatically in the decades leading up to that fateful summer. London's population had exploded with the Industrial Revolution, swelling from just under 1 million inhabitants at the turn of the century to over 2.5 million by 1850. Each of these people produced waste, and London, ancient and sprawling as it was, had no coordinated system for dealing with it. For centuries, the city had relied on cesspools, pits dug beneath houses and businesses where human waste accumulated, until it could be removed by night soil men, workers who came after dark to empty the pits and haul their noxious cargo to farms outside the city. It was a system that had worked tolerably well when London was smaller, when there was still space between buildings and the population density allowed for some natural decomposition and drainage. But as the city grew and houses were packed ever more tightly together, as courtyards were filled in and every available square foot was built upon, the cesspools began to fail. They overflowed, seeping into cellars and contaminating wells. They collapsed, creating sinkholes that swallowed carts and occasionally people. They bred disease with terrifying efficiency. Cholera, that great killer of the 19th century, found in London's crowded slums and overflowing cesspools the perfect conditions for its spread. The outbreaks of 1832 and 1849 killed tens of thousands, striking with such speed that people who went to bed healthy were dead by morning. Then, with the best of intentions, the authorities made everything worse. Convinced that the cesspools were the problem, they mandated that every house must be connected to the sewers. This seemed logical. The city did have sewers, after all, ancient tunnels and channels that had been built to carry away rainwater. Surely they could handle human waste as well. But these sewers had never been designed for such use. They were too small, too few, and almost all of them emptied directly into the Thames or its tributaries. The result was predictable. The cesspools, which had at least contained the waste in one place, were replaced by a system that efficiently channeled every drop of sewage, every handful of filth, directly into the river. At the same time, the water closet was becoming popular among those who could afford it. These new toilets used water to flush waste away, which seemed wonderfully sanitary compared to the old chamber pots and privies. But each flush sent gallons of water and waste into the sewers, multiplying the volume of effluent flowing into the Thames. By the 1850s, the river had become London's cesspool, receiving the waste of over 2 million people. Every factory, every slaughterhouse, every tannery and dye works added its own particular poisons to the mix. The great meat markets sent blood and offal flowing into the water. Gas works contributed tar and chemicals. Hospitals dumped everything from surgical waste to the soiled bandages of infectious patients. And still the city grew and still more waste poured into the river. The Thames had long since ceased to be tidal in any meaningful sense within London. The accumulation of sludge on the riverbed raised its level, while the sheer volume of effluent overwhelmed the natural ebb and flow. In some places, particularly along the southern shore where the land was lower, the banks became quagmires of liquid filth that could swallow a person who ventured too close. Children played at the water's edge at their peril. There were stories, whispered in Southwark and Lambeth, of people who had disappeared into the mud and were never found. The smell had always been bad, particularly in summer when the heat accelerated decomposition. But the summer of 1858 brought something unprecedented. The heat wave was exceptional, the most intense in memory, and it persisted week after week. The water level dropped, exposing vast mudflats of concentrated sewage. These baked in the sun, releasing gases that had previously been trapped beneath the surface. The wind, such as it was, came from the south and west, carrying the stench directly into the heart of the city. Westminster, that seat of British power, found itself on the front lines of the assault. The Houses of Parliament sat directly on the riverbank, and the smell invaded the chambers with such force that business became impossible. Members held handkerchiefs soaked in chloride of lime to their faces. The curtains on the riverside windows were soaked in the same chemical, but it made little difference. The smell penetrated everything. Benjamin Disraeli, then leading the Conservative opposition, fled from the chamber mid-speech, overcome by the stench. William Gladstone, his Liberal rival, managed to remain, but only by breathing through his mouth and taking frequent breaks to rush to windows on the north side of the building for fresh air. The Speaker of the House, attempting to maintain order during a debate, vomited into his handkerchief and was forced to adjourn the session. The law courts at Westminster fared no better. Barristers abandoned cases mid-trial. Judges refused to hear arguments, declaring that justice could not be administered under such conditions. One particularly determined judge attempted to continue, but his clerk fainted, and the jury foreman announced that they could not concentrate enough to follow the testimony. The court was adjourned, and most of the legal establishment fled London entirely. But it was not just the powerful who suffered. The poor, living in riverside slums, endured conditions that beggar description. In Bermondsey and Rotherhithe, in the rookeries of Southwark, people lived in buildings whose foundations sat in the toxic mud. Their cellars flooded not with water, but with sewage during high tide. Children played in streets that were little more than open drains. The death rate in these areas, already appalling, climbed higher. Doctors and public health officials had been warning about the state of the Thames for years, but their voices had been largely ignored. Now, with the stench invading even the most privileged precincts, their warnings took on new urgency. Yet even among the medical establishment there was confusion about the nature of the threat. The dominant theory of disease transmission was the miasma theory, which held that illness was caused by bad air, by the foul vapours rising from decomposing matter. By this logic, the smell itself was the danger. The solution, many argued, was to mask the odour or disperse it, to treat the symptom rather than the cause. Schemes were proposed to spray perfume over the river, to burn aromatic compounds along the embankments, to somehow blow the smell away from the city. These were the desperate ideas of desperate men facing a problem they did not fully understand. A few voices argued differently. John Snow, a physician who had investigated the cholera outbreak of 1854, had concluded that the disease was waterborne, spread not through bad air, but through contaminated water. His careful study of the outbreak in Soho, where he had traced cases to a single contaminated pump on Broad Street, had provided compelling evidence. But the miasma theory was deeply entrenched, and Snow's ideas were dismissed by many of his colleagues. Yet even those who believed in miasma could see that something had to be done about the river itself. The stench was proof that something was terribly wrong, even if they misunderstood exactly what. And more practically, the smell had done something that decades of death and disease had not. It had inconvenienced the powerful. When the poor died of cholera in their thousands, it was tragic, but distant. When members of Parliament could not conduct business because of the smell, action became urgent. The man who would ultimately solve the problem had been waiting in the wings for years. Joseph Bazalgette was chief engineer to the Metropolitan Board of Works, a position he had held since 1856. He was not a man given to drama or grand rhetoric. Short, stocky, with a methodical mind and an engineer's attention to detail, he had spent years studying London's drainage problems and developing plans for a comprehensive solution. But plans required money, and money required political will, and political will had been in short supply. Bazalgette had proposed an integrated system of sewers that would intercept the waste before it reached the Thames, carrying it east through great tunnels to outfalls well downstream of the city, where the tides could disperse it into the sea. It was an ambitious project, perhaps the largest civil engineering undertaking in history at that point. It would require the excavation of millions of cubic yards of earth, the construction of over 1,000 miles of sewers, the building of massive pumping stations to lift sewage over London's hills. The cost would be enormous. Previous proposals for sewer reform had foundered on questions of cost and jurisdiction. London was not a single unified city, but a patchwork of parishes and districts, each jealous of its authority. Getting them to agree on anything was nearly impossible. Getting them to fund a project of this scale seemed beyond reach. But the Great Stink changed everything. In June 1858, with the smell at its worst, Parliament was scheduled to move to Hampton Court Palace, where the air was presumably fresher. The prospect of the nation's legislators fleeing London was intolerable to many. Something had to be done, and it had to be done immediately. Benjamin Disraeli, despite his earlier flight from the chamber, now emerged as a champion of action. He introduced legislation that would allow the Metropolitan Board of Works to borrow the money needed for Bazalgette's plan. The debate, conducted with handkerchiefs pressed to faces and frequent breaks for fresh air, was remarkably brief. Members who might ordinarily have quibbled over costs or jurisdictional issues found themselves eager to vote for anything that might end the smell. The legislation passed in a matter of days, a speed almost unprecedented for such a major undertaking. By mid-July the work could begin, but Bazalgette's challenge was only beginning. The scale of the project was staggering. He proposed to build 3 major sewers north of the Thames and 2 to the south, each running parallel to the river and intercepting the hundreds of smaller sewers that currently emptied into it. The northern sewers would be built at different heights to handle different areas of the city, following the natural slope of the land. The southern sewers would face even greater challenges, as much of South London sat below the high tide mark. The northern high-level sewer would run from Hampstead through Highgate and across to Stoke Newington, collecting waste from the highest parts of London. The middle-level sewer would run from Kensal Green through Bayswater and along the line of modern Kensington, Chelsea, and into central London. The low-level sewer would run closer to the river. from Chiswick through Fulham, Chelsea and Westminster, ending at a massive pumping station Bazalgette planned to build at Abbey Mills in the East End. This pumping station would be necessary because the low-level sewer, following the lay of the land, would be well below the level needed to continue east. The sewage would have to be lifted nearly 50 feet so it could flow by gravity the rest of the way to the outfall at Beckton. The pumping station itself would be a cathedral of Victorian engineering, a grand building housing enormous steam engines capable of moving millions of gallons of sewage per day. South of the river, the challenges were even greater. The land was flatter, lying mostly below the high tide mark. This meant that almost all the sewage would need to be pumped. Bazalgette planned a high-level sewer from Balham and Clapham, and a low-level sewer that would require a major pumping station at Deptford. To lift the sewage to a level where it could flow by gravity to the southern outfall at Crossness, the engineering problems were immense. The sewers had to be built large enough to handle not just current sewage flows, but those of a much larger future population. They had to be strong enough to withstand the weight of the buildings and traffic above them. They had to be watertight to prevent leakage either in or out, and in many places they had to be built beneath existing streets and buildings without causing those structures to collapse. Bazalgette's solution was to build the sewers primarily of brick, using a distinctive egg-shaped profile that proved stronger than a circular cross-section and better at maintaining flow during low-volume periods. The bricks were laid with extraordinary precision, with joints sealed so perfectly that the sewers remain watertight more than 150 years later. Where the sewers passed beneath important buildings or had to cross valleys, Bazalgette used iron pipes, massive cast-iron tubes riveted together and sealed with lead. The construction process itself was an epic of Victorian engineering. Thousands of workers, many of them Irish immigrants fleeing famine in their homeland, descended into excavations that were often 20 or 30 feet deep. They worked in shifts around the clock, digging by lamplight when necessary. The work was dangerous. Cave-ins were common, burying workers alive. Floods from broken water mains or breached sewers could drown entire crews. The sewage itself was toxic, and many workers fell ill from exposure to the gases and filth. Yet the work proceeded with remarkable speed. Bazalgette drove his teams hard, but he also paid them well by the standards of the time and provided medical care for those who fell ill. He designed innovative safety features, including new methods for shoring up excavations and systems for ventilating the tunnels. He was on site constantly inspecting every aspect of the work, demanding corrections when standards were not met. The construction transformed London. Great trenches appeared across the city, disrupting traffic and daily life. In some areas, particularly in the West End, residents complained bitterly about the noise and disruption. But in the poorer areas where the need was greatest, many welcomed the work. The very presence of the construction crews, the sight of progress being made, gave hope that things might improve. Bazalgette also had to build the embankments that would become one of Victorian London's most visible legacies. The riverside was a chaotic jumble of wharves, stairs and mudflats. Bazalgette's plan called for building up the riverbank, creating a uniform embankment that would not only improve the appearance of the river, but also provide space to run the low-level sewer along its length. The Victoria Embankment on the north side and the Albert Embankment on the south transformed the city's relationship with the river. These embankments narrowed the Thames, speeding its flow and helping to flush away the accumulation of centuries. They also created new land, which Bazalgette used to build riverside gardens and the wide roads that still carry traffic along the Thames today. Underground, invisible to the users of these elegant new spaces, the sewers performed their unglamorous but essential work. The pumping stations were engineering marvels in their own right, At Abbey Mills and Crossness, Bazalgette commissioned buildings that were Byzantine in their grandeur, with ornate ironwork and coloured brick. The machines inside were works of art as much as engineering, with polished brass and painted cast iron. These were not hidden infrastructure, but proud declarations of Victorian confidence and capability. Sewage might be unpleasant, but dealing with it was work worthy of beauty and celebration. The outfalls, where the sewers finally discharged into the Thames, were built at Beckton on the north bank and Crossness on the south, well east of the city where the river was wide and the tides strong. Here, Bazalgette built reservoirs that would hold the sewage until high tide, when it could be released into the fast-flowing water and carried out to sea. It was not by modern standards treatment. The sewage was still sewage, just discharged far enough downstream that it became someone else's problem. But for London it was a revolution. The construction took years. The first sections of the northern sewers began operation in 1859, less than a year after the Great Stink, providing immediate if limited relief. But the full system was not completed until 1875, nearly 20 years after Bazalgette had first proposed it. In that time, over 318 million bricks were laid. The main sewers alone stretched for more than 80 miles, with over 1,000 miles of smaller street sewers feeding into them. The project employed thousands of workers and cost over £3 million, an enormous sum at the time. But even as the construction proceeded, London's understanding of disease was evolving. The miasma theory was slowly giving way to germ theory, the understanding that diseases were caused by specific microorganisms rather than bad air. This shift was driven by several factors, but one of the most important was the simple fact that Bazalgette's sewers worked. As sections of the sewer system came online, the areas they served saw dramatic reductions in disease. Cholera outbreaks became less frequent and less severe. The death rate from other intestinal diseases dropped. This was difficult to explain if disease was caused by bad air. After all, the smell had been reduced, but not eliminated, particularly in the early years when only part of the system was operational. But if disease was caused by contaminated water, as John Snow had argued, then Bazalgette's sewers were keeping that contaminated water away from wells and water supplies, and the reduction in disease made perfect sense. Snow himself did not live to see his theory triumph. He died in 1858, the year of the Great Stink, still defending his ideas against sceptical colleagues. But by the 1870s, as Bazalgette's system neared completion and London's death rates continued to fall, the evidence became overwhelming. Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany provided the scientific proof, identifying specific bacteria that caused specific diseases. The miasma theory died, not suddenly, but gradually, fading as the evidence against it accumulated. Bazalgette's sewers thus represent a paradox. They were designed based on a flawed understanding of disease, built to eliminate bad smells rather than harmful bacteria. Yet they worked, not despite the flawed theory, but because they happened to address the real problem as well as the perceived one. In removing sewage from the water supply, they eliminated the route by which cholera and other diseases spread, even if that was not their primary purpose. The impact on London was profound. The city that had been the sick man of Europe became healthier than it had been in centuries. The death rate, particularly infant mortality, fell dramatically. Cholera, which had struck in deadly epidemics every few years, nearly disappeared. The last major outbreak in London was in 1866, when a small area not yet connected to Bazalgette's system suffered a limited epidemic. Once that area was connected, the outbreak ceased, but the sewers did more than improve public health. They changed how Londoners thought about their city and their relationship to the natural world. Before Bazalgette, the Thames was both essential and dangerous, providing water and transportation, but also threatening disease and death. The river was nature, red in tooth and claw, at the heart of civilization. After Bazalgette, it was tamed, controlled, reduced to a predictable element in a managed system. This change was visible in how people used the river. Before the sewers, the Thames was avoided except when necessary. Only the poor lived close to the water, and they suffered for it. But as the water quality improved, the Thames became a recreational space. Rowing became popular among the middle classes. The riverside became fashionable. The embankments with their gardens and promenades became places to see and be seen. Yet there was also loss in this transformation. The wild Thames, the river of mudlarks and watermen, of tides strong enough to turn mills and currents that could sweep a man away, this river was diminished. It became cleaner but also more constrained, its power channeled and controlled. The salmon and other fish that had once filled its waters did not return, at least not immediately. The river ran cleaner but also narrower, faster, more predictable. The Thames had fought back against the city's abuse, had made London uninhabitable during that summer of 1858, but human ingenuity had prevailed, at least for a time. Bazalgette sewers were a victory of engineering over nature, of order over chaos. They represented the Victorian belief that any problem could be solved with enough money, effort, and rational thinking. Yet nature is not so easily defeated. The sewers that seemed so adequate in 1875 were strained by 1900 as London's population continued to grow. By the mid-20th century, they were often overwhelmed, particularly during heavy rains when stormwater and sewage mixed in the same pipes. The outfalls at Beckton and Crossness, which had seemed so far from civilization, found themselves surrounded by development. The sewage that had been diluted by the tides in the 1870s was accumulating in the estuary by the 1950s, creating new problems downstream. London responded with upgrades and additions, with treatment plants that actually cleaned the sewage rather than just discharging it. The river slowly recovered. By the late 20th century, salmon had returned to the Thames for the first time in over a century. The water that had been biologically dead in the 1950s was again supporting fish, birds, and even the occasional seal that wandered up from the estuary. But the fundamental infrastructure, the brick sewers and iron pipes, remained Bazalgette's. His work was so well built, so far-sighted in its capacity, that it continued to serve a city many times larger than the one he had known. Parts of his system are still in use today, handling sewage for the modern metropolis that would have been unimaginable to Victorian engineers. The Great Stink of 1858 lasted only a few months, but it changed London forever. It forced action on a problem that had been ignored for too long, that had killed thousands while the powerful looked away. The smell ironically saved lives. By making the Thames's pollution impossible to ignore, it created the political will necessary to address the underlying sanitation crisis. The story of the Great Stink and Bazalgette sewers is often told as a triumph of Victorian engineering, a testament to human ingenuity and determination.
And it is that.
But it is also a story about power and privilege, about how problems are ignored until they affect the right people. The poor had been dying of cholera for decades, but it was only when Parliament itself was affected that money suddenly became available. It is a story about unintended consequences, about how the solution to one problem created another. The cesspools were eliminated, but only by turning the Thames into an open sewer. The water closets that seemed so sanitary multiplied the volume of waste beyond any system's ability to handle it. Each solution created new problems that required new solutions. It is a story about the limits of knowledge and the danger of acting on incomplete understanding. The miasma theory was wrong, but the sewers built on its assumptions happened to work. What if they had not? What if the focus on eliminating bad air had led to solutions that did not address the real problem?
How many more would have died before the error was recognized?
And it is a story about nature's resilience and revenge. The Thames, abused for centuries, fought back with a weapon more powerful than any plague: smell. It made itself so obnoxious that human society had to respond. In a sense, the river won, forcing the city to change its behavior, to treat the water with more respect. The sewers were as much a concession to the Thames as they were a victory over it. The summer of 1858 lives on in memory as the Great Stink, but its impact reverberates far beyond that single season. It marked a turning point in urban history, the moment when a great city recognized that it could not simply dump its waste into the nearest river and expect no consequences. It proved that large-scale infrastructure projects could succeed, that cities could be fundamentally reshaped by determined leadership and engineering skill. Bazalgette sewers became a model for cities around the world. As other industrial centres faced their own sanitation crises, they looked to London for solutions. Engineers from Paris, New York, Berlin, and Tokyo studied Bazalgette's designs. The principles he established, the egg-shaped sewers, the interceptor system, the pumping stations, were copied and adapted across the globe. The great stink of London led to cleaner cities everywhere. But the story also raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. How many crises could be prevented if we acted before they reached catastrophic proportions? How many problems do we ignore because they primarily affect the poor and powerless? What environmental disasters are we creating now that will force future generations to take emergency action? Climate change, like the pollution of the Thames, is a problem we have known about for decades. Like the Victorian authorities who watched cholera kill thousands without taking decisive action, we have delayed and debated while the problem grows worse. It may take a modern equivalent of the Great Stink, some consequence so immediate and undeniable that it forces action before we truly address the crisis. The Thames today is cleaner than it has been in centuries. The sewers continue to function, supplemented by modern treatment plants and new infrastructure. The river supports a diverse ecosystem from fish and birds to marine mammals. It is, in many ways, a victory story, proof that environmental damage can be reversed with sufficient effort and investment. Yet the river also carries warnings. During heavy rains, the Victorian sewers still overflow, dumping untreated sewage into the Thames. Climate change is bringing more intense rainfall, more frequent flooding, testing the limits of infrastructure designed for a different climate. London is building a new super sewer, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, to capture these overflows, a project that echoes Bazalgette's work 150 years later. The challenges change, but the need for infrastructure investment remains constant. The Great Stink forced London to confront an uncomfortable truth, that a great city could not prosper while swimming in its own filth. It required a fundamental reimagining of urban infrastructure, a willingness to invest enormous sums in systems that would be invisible to most citizens. Bazalgette's sewers were not glamorous. They did not create immediate wealth or inspire patriotic pride, but they saved countless lives and made London livable for generations. There is something profound in the fact that one of the greatest engineering achievements of the Victorian era was dedicated to dealing with waste, to creating infrastructure that most people would never see and certainly never want to think about. It suggests a maturity of civilization, a recognition that the mundane matters of sanitation and public health are as important as any cathedral or palace. The workers who built the sewers, who descended into the muck and darkness, who risked their lives in cave-ins and floods, are largely forgotten. Their names were not recorded in the history books. No monuments were erected to their memory. Yet their labour made modern London possible. They dug the tunnels through which the city's waste still flows, laid the bricks that still keep that waste contained and moving. Their work was as important as any battle won by British arms, any law passed by Parliament, any scientific discovery made in laboratories. Joseph Bazalgette received recognition in his lifetime. He was knighted in 1874, his achievement acknowledged by the Crown. But even his name is not widely known today outside engineering circles. The sewers are his monument and they are invisible. Perhaps this is fitting. The best infrastructure, the most successful engineering, is that which works so well it can be forgotten, that becomes so reliable it fades into the background of daily life. The Thames that flows through London today is not the same river that produced the Great Stink. It has been shaped by human hands, confined by embankments, cleaned by sewage treatment plants, managed by environmental regulations. Yet it is still the Thames, still tidal, still connected to the sea. The river remains patient and powerful, capable of flooding when humans forget to respect its force, capable of supporting life when given the chance. The relationship between London and its river has evolved from exploitation to something more like partnership. The city takes water from the Thames and returns it cleaner than before. The river provides recreational space, wildlife habitat, and a connection to London's maritime past. It is no longer the sick patient of 1858, nor is it the wild waterway of medieval times. It is something new, a hybrid of nature and infrastructure, shaped by human needs but retaining its essential character. This evolution mirrors changes in human understanding of our relationship with nature. The Victorians believed they could dominate and control the natural world, bending it to human will through engineering and industry. The Great Stink was both a failure of that approach and its ultimate triumph. The Thames could not be ignored or simply exploited. It fought back, forcing humans to engage with it on terms that recognized its power. But the response, Bazalgette sewers, was the ultimate expression of human control, channeling and managing the river's waste-carrying capacity. We understand now that such control is never complete, that nature adapts and responds to our interventions in ways we cannot always predict. The sewers that seem to solve the problem permanently are now being supplemented and upgraded to handle challenges Bazalgette never imagined. The clean river of today could become polluted again if we fail to maintain and improve the infrastructure that protects it. The Great Stink was a moment of crisis, but also a moment of choice. London could have continued as it was, accepting disease and death as unavoidable urban realities. Many cities at the time did exactly that. But London chose to act, to invest in infrastructure, to imagine a healthier future, and then build it. That choice, forced by the stench of a single summer, echoes through the decades. Every city faces such moments when the accumulated problems of growth and development reach a critical point. The response determines not just the immediate outcome, but the trajectory of development for generations. Infrastructure investment is always expensive, always disruptive, always controversial. But the cost of inaction is often much higher, paid in lives lost and opportunities missed. The summer of 1858 showed that even the most powerful city in the world, the capital of the largest empire in history, was vulnerable to its own waste. No amount of military might or economic power could protect against the smell. No social status could shield one from disease carried in polluted water. The river was the great equalizer, threatening rich and poor alike. But the solution, when it came, did not benefit everyone equally. The sewers were built first in the areas where the powerful lived and worked. Westminster was connected before Whitechapel, the West End before the East End. The poor waited longer for relief, endured more years of disease and filth. This pattern has repeated throughout history and continues today, with the most vulnerable communities often the last to receive infrastructure improvements. Yet for all its flaws, for all the inequities in its implementation, Bazalgette's system did eventually serve the entire city. The sewers built in wealthy areas had to connect to those in poor neighborhoods for the system to work. The pumping stations lifted sewage from slums and mansions alike. The Thames was cleaned for everyone, even if that was not the primary intention. This interconnection is fundamental to urban infrastructure.
A city is a system, and a system is only as strong as its weakest link.
Disease in one neighborhood will spread to others. Pollution of the river affects everyone who depends on it. The realization that wealthy and poor were connected, that their fates were intertwined, was crucial to galvanizing action on the sewers. The same realization is needed today for challenges like climate change. The atmosphere does not respect borders or social class. Rising seas will flood rich neighborhoods and poor ones. Heat waves will kill regardless of wealth, though the poor will die in greater numbers. We are all downstream from someone, all connected through the systems that sustain modern life. The Great Stink forced this realization on Victorian London. The smell could not be confined to poor neighbourhoods. It invaded Parliament, disrupted the courts, drove the wealthy from their homes. Only when the problem became universal did the solution become politically possible. This is both encouraging and troubling. Encouraging because it shows that comprehensive action is possible when the need becomes undeniable. Troubling because it suggests we will only act when crisis becomes catastrophe. The Thames had been dying for decades before 1858, choking on sewage while thousands died of cholera. But it was the smell, not the death, that finally prompted action. This says something about human nature and political systems that we might prefer not to acknowledge. We respond to immediate discomfort more readily than to abstract danger. We act when we are personally affected, not necessarily when others suffer. Yet once action was taken, once Bazalgette's vision became reality, the benefits extended far beyond those who had demanded it. The sewers saved lives that would never have been counted, prevented diseases that would never be recorded. Children who might have died in their first year instead grew to adulthood. Families that might have been devastated by cholera remained intact. The sewers wove themselves into the fabric of the city so completely that their presence became invisible, noticed only in their absence. This is the nature of good infrastructure. It creates value that is difficult to measure, prevents problems that never occur, enables lives that might never have been possible. The sewers did not just remove waste. They made dense urban living possible at a scale never before achieved. They allowed London to continue growing, to remain competitive with other great cities, to function as the capital of an empire. Without the sewers, London might have choked on its own growth.
Other cities might have overtaken it.
The financial markets, the trading houses, the government offices all depended on a city that functioned, where disease was controlled and life was possible for the millions who made their homes there. The economic impact of the sewers is impossible to calculate precisely, but it was certainly enormous. Healthier workers were more productive. Families not devastated by disease had more resources to spend and invest. The city became more attractive to talent and capital. London's dominance in the late Victorian period owed something to steam power and telegraphs, to empire and trade, but also to the unglamorous fact that its sewers worked. Yet the sewers also locked London into a particular pattern of development. Once the infrastructure was in place, built at enormous cost, the city's growth followed the lines Bazalgette had drawn. Areas served by sewers developed more quickly. The embankments shaped how people moved through the city, where buildings were constructed, how the river was used. Infrastructure, once built, becomes destiny, determining the shape of the city for generations. This is both the power and the problem of large-scale infrastructure. It solves problems but also constrains future choices. The Victorian sewers, designed for a city of a few million, still shape London today, a metropolis of nearly 10 million. They work, but they are stretched to capacity. The Thames Tideway Tunnel, the massive new sewer being built under the river, is necessary precisely because Bazalgette's system, brilliant as it was, cannot handle the demands of the modern city. Each generation must maintain and upgrade the infrastructure it inherits, must invest in systems for the future. This is difficult politically because infrastructure is expensive and unglamorous. Politicians prefer ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new buildings over maintenance of century-old sewers, but failure to invest eventually leads to crisis, to systems that break down, to infrastructure that cannot meet modern needs. London learned this lesson in the summer of 1858. It forgot and had to relearn it in the 20th century, when the sewers began to overflow and the Thames became polluted again. It is learning it once more in the 21st century, as climate change and population growth push the system to its limits. The lesson is always the same: invest in infrastructure or pay a higher price later in crisis response. The Great Stink was a moment when the price of inaction became unbearable. when the accumulated cost of decades of neglect could no longer be ignored. The smell was the bill coming due, presented in a form that could not be disputed or delayed. Parliament, that great deliberative body capable of debating issues for years, passed Bazalgette's funding in days because the alternative was unthinkable. We should not need crisis to prompt action, but history suggests we often do. The challenge is to act before the crisis becomes catastrophic, to recognize tipping points before they are reached, to invest in prevention rather than cure. This requires political courage and long-term thinking, qualities that are always in short supply but never more needed than when facing systemic challenges. The Thames in 1858 was a symptom of such a challenge. The river's pollution was not a sudden disaster but the accumulated result of decades of growth without adequate planning. Every household that connected to the inadequate sewers, every factory that dumped waste in the river, every decision to defer action because the immediate cost seemed too high, contributed to the crisis. No single actor was responsible, yet everyone who benefited from London's growth bore some share. This diffusion of responsibility made action difficult.
Who should pay to clean up the river?
Should it be the wealthy who could afford it? The riverside residents who suffered most directly? The businesses that profited from the city's growth? The government representing all citizens? These questions nearly prevented action, as different groups argued over who should bear the cost. The Great Stink cut through these debates by making the problem universal. When everyone suffered, arguments about who should pay became less important than simply solving the problem. This is not justice exactly. The poor had suffered long before the smell affected the wealthy. But it was practical politics, the art of the possible in action. The sewers were built by finding a funding mechanism that spread the cost broadly enough that no single group could block the project. Bazalgette's success owed much to his engineering skill, but also to his political acumen. He worked with politicians, not against them. He presented his plans clearly, showing how they would solve the immediate problem while also serving the city's long-term needs. He adapted his designs when necessary to accommodate political realities, but never compromised on the essential integrity of the system. He understood that engineering, particularly on this scale, was as much about people as pipes. The construction of the sewers required the cooperation of hundreds of property owners, dozens of parishes and districts, multiple levels of government. Each had to be convinced, cajoled, or compelled to participate. Legal battles had to be fought and won. Compensation had to be negotiated for land taken and businesses disrupted. Bazalgette managed this complex political and legal process while simultaneously directing the engineering work, a feat perhaps as impressive as the technical achievement itself. His leadership style was Victorian in its assumption of authority, but also surprisingly modern in its attention to worker welfare and public communication. He published regular reports on the project's progress, keeping the public informed and maintaining support even when costs overran projections or delays occurred. He was honest about challenges while projecting confidence that they could be overcome. This transparency helped maintain political support through the long years of construction. The workers themselves were a remarkable cross-section of Victorian society. Alongside the Irish immigrants were English labourers from the countryside, drawn to London by the promise of steady work. There were skilled bricklayers and masons, men who took pride in their craft and whose work would outlast them by centuries. There were engineers and surveyors applying the latest scientific knowledge to practical problems. And there were the unskilled diggers, the men who did the hardest and most dangerous work for the lowest pay. They worked in conditions that would be unacceptable today. The tunnels were poorly ventilated, filled with brick dust and the smell of sewage. The risk of cave-ins was constant. Several workers died during the construction, buried in collapses or drowned in floods. Many more were injured or fell ill from exposure to the toxic environment. Yet they continued, driven by the need for wages, the pride of contributing to a great project, or simply the Victorian work ethic that valued perseverance above comfort. The impact on these workers' families is rarely discussed in histories of the sewers, but it was real and often harsh. A man injured in a tunnel collapse might be unable to work, leaving his family destitute. A breadwinner who died left widows and orphans with little support. The wages were good by the standards of the time, but they came at a cost measured in health and sometimes lives. The sewers were built on the backs of working people, and their sacrifice should be remembered alongside the engineering achievement. Yet those workers also took pride in their work. In interviews and letters, some surviving from the period, they spoke of being part of something important, of building infrastructure that would serve London for generations. They understood, perhaps better than the politicians and the public, what they were creating. Every brick they laid, every tunnel they dug, was a direct contribution to making the city healthier and more livable. This pride was not misplaced. The sewers did exactly what they were designed to do. They removed sewage from the water supply and the immediate environment. They made the Thames navigable again, eliminating the worst of the smell and pollution. They created the foundation for London's continued growth through the late 19th and 20th centuries. The workers who built them had every right to be proud. The sewers also represented a shift in how Victorian society thought about public works. Earlier infrastructure projects like railways and bridges were often built by private companies for profit. But the sewers could not be profitable in the traditional sense. They had to serve everyone, rich and poor, without regard for ability to pay. They were too large for any private company to build, too important to leave to market forces. They required government action and public funding. This marked an expansion of what society considered proper roles for government. The Victorian state, despite its reputation for laissez-faire economics, was willing to take on major infrastructure projects when the need was clear and the private sector could not or would not act. The sewers set a precedent for other public works, from water supplies to electricity networks to, eventually, the welfare state itself. The idea that government had a responsibility to ensure basic sanitation and public health, that these were not individual responsibilities but collective ones requiring collective action, was revolutionary. It challenged the prevailing ideology that saw poverty and disease as individual failings rather than systemic problems. The sewers could not help but be socialist in their effect, if not their intent. They benefited everyone but especially the poor, who had suffered most from inadequate sanitation. This tension between Victorian individualism and the reality that some problems require collective solutions runs through the entire story of the sewers. Bazalgette himself was a good Victorian liberal, believing in hard work and individual responsibility. Yet, his greatest achievement was a collective solution to a shared problem, infrastructure that could only work if everyone participated. The sewers were a socialist project built by a capitalist society, proof that ideology sometimes bends to necessity. The Great Stink forced this bending. When the smell made Westminster uninhabitable, theories about individual responsibility and market solutions became irrelevant. The problem was real, immediate, and undeniable. Only government action on a massive scale could solve it. Once that action was taken and proven successful, it became harder to argue against similar interventions in other areas of public health and welfare. The sewers thus contributed to the evolution of British governance, helping to create the modern understanding that government has a responsibility for the health and welfare of its citizens. This was not Bazalgette's intention. He was an engineer solving an engineering problem, not a political theorist reimagining the role of the state. But great infrastructure projects have implications beyond their immediate purpose. They reshape cities physically but also politically and socially. London after Bazalgette was different not just in its cleaner river and healthier population, but in its expectations of what was possible. If sewers could be built on such a scale, what else might be achieved through collective action and government initiative? The question would shape British politics for the next century, leading to debates about public housing, national health care, and the welfare state. But in the immediate aftermath of the sewers' completion, the most visible impact was on the river itself. The Thames, which had been an enemy during the Great Stink, began its long transformation back toward health. The smell diminished, though it would be decades before it disappeared entirely. The water, while still far from pristine, was less obviously foul. The banks, no longer coated in exposed sewage during low tide, became places where people might actually want to walk. The return of life to the river was gradual. Fish did not immediately reappear. The ecosystem had been too damaged, the water still too polluted despite the sewer's operation. But the process of recovery had begun. Small organisms that could tolerate pollution began to thrive. These supported larger creatures, slowly rebuilding the food chain. Birds that had abandoned the Thames began to return, finding enough food to sustain them. By the end of the 19th century, the Thames was noticeably healthier than it had been in 1858. It was still a working river, crowded with ships and barges, its water murky with the sediment of commerce. But it was no longer toxic, no longer a threat to public health. Londoners could live near the river without fearing disease. This alone was a tremendous achievement, the fruit of Bazalgette's labour and Victorian determination. Yet the river's recovery was not linear. The 20th century brought new challenges. 2 world wars devastated London's infrastructure. Bombs damaged sewers and treatment facilities. Economic depression and then wartime austerity meant deferred maintenance. Industrial pollution increased as new factories were built. By the 1950s, the Thames was again in crisis, biologically dead in parts, unable to support fish. This second crisis prompted a second wave of action. New environmental regulations limited industrial pollution. The sewage treatment plants that had been built at the outfalls were upgraded to actually treat the waste rather than just discharge it. Investments were made in maintaining and improving Bazalgette's sewers. By the 1970s, the river was recovering again, and by the 1980s, salmon had returned for the first time since the 19th century. This cycle of degradation and recovery, crisis and response, is a pattern that repeats throughout environmental history. We damage ecosystems through carelessness or greed, then spend enormous effort restoring them. We would be better off not damaging them in the first place, but human societies seem to require crisis before taking action. The Great Stink was such a crisis for Victorian London. The dead river of the 1950s was another for post-war Britain. Each time, the recovery has been real but incomplete. The Thames today is healthier than at any time since the Industrial Revolution. It supports diverse wildlife, from fish to seals to the occasional whale that wanders too far upstream.
But it is not a pristine river.
It still receives treated sewage from millions of people. During heavy rains, it still receives untreated overflow from the combined sewers that date back to Bazalgette's time. Plastic pollution, barely conceived in the 19th century, now litters its banks and water. These ongoing challenges show that the work is never finished. Each generation must maintain what was built before while adapting to new problems. The sewers that seemed permanent when Bazalgette built them require constant maintenance. The treatment plants need upgrading to meet new standards. The Thames Tideway Tunnel, scheduled for completion in the mid-2020s, will help capture overflow. But it is itself an admission that the Victorian system, for all its brilliance, is not sufficient for the modern city. Yet Bazalgette's core achievement remains. The brick sewers he built in the 1860s still carry the bulk of London's sewage. The pumping stations at Abbey Mills and Crossness, upgraded with modern equipment, still perform their essential function. The embankments still shape the river and provide pathways through the city. The fundamental infrastructure has lasted, proving the value of building to high standards even when costs are high. This longevity has economic implications. The sewers have paid for themselves many times over in the 150 years since they were built. The initial investment of £3 million seems tiny compared to the value they have created and the costs they have prevented. Every disease outbreak avoided, every life saved, every day of productive work enabled has added to the return on investment. Infrastructure that lasts generations creates value that compounds over time. Modern cost-benefit analyses often undervalue such long-term returns. They discount future benefits heavily, making investments that pay off over decades appear less attractive. This bias toward short-term thinking makes it harder to build infrastructure that will serve multiple generations. Bazalgette did not have sophisticated cost-benefit models. He built sewers that would last because that was the engineering standard of his time. Perhaps we should learn from this approach, valuing durability and longevity more highly even when initial costs are greater. The Great Stink forced such long-term thinking by making the short-term situation unbearable. Parliament could not wait for perfect information or optimal cost-benefit ratios. They had to act, and they chose to act boldly, funding a project whose full benefits would only be realized over generations. This kind of political courage is rare, but the results speak for themselves. London today benefits from decisions made under pressure in 1858, from infrastructure built when Victoria was on the throne. Looking back from our current century, the story of the Great Stink and Bazalgette sewers offers lessons that remain relevant. Infrastructure matters. Public health requires public investment. Some problems are too large for individual or market solutions and require government action. Environmental damage has consequences that may not be immediately obvious but become undeniable over time. Crisis can force action that should have been taken earlier, and good engineering, built to last, creates value for generations. But the story also reminds us of uncomfortable truths. We often wait until crisis becomes catastrophe before acting. The poor suffer first and longest, while the powerful remain insulated from consequences until those consequences become universal. Political action often requires that the powerful be personally affected, not just the problems exist, and solutions, even effective ones, often create new problems that future generations must address. The Thames today is not the river of 1858, nor is it the pristine waterway of pre-industrial times. It is something new, a hybrid of nature and human engineering, shaped by centuries of intervention and adaptation. It bears the scars of pollution, but also the signs of recovery. It is controlled by embankments and sewers, but still responds to tides and floods. It is, perhaps, a metaphor for our relationship with the natural world, one of continuous negotiation and compromise. The river's recovery from the Great Stink was not automatic or inevitable. It required sustained effort, continuous investment, and political will maintained across generations. This is the real lesson of Bazalgette's sewers. The engineering was brilliant, but the maintenance and adaptation have been equally important. Infrastructure is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing commitment. Each generation must decide to invest in the systems that sustain modern life. As we face challenges like climate change, rising seas, and more intense storms, London's sewers are being tested in ways Bazalgette never imagined. The Thames Tideway Tunnel is necessary because climate change means more frequent extreme rainfall events that overwhelm the Victorian sewers. The embankments face rising sea levels that threaten flooding. The treatment plants must handle new pollutants, from microplastics to pharmaceutical residues, that were unknown in the 19th century. Yet the fundamental infrastructure Bazalgette created provides the foundation for these adaptations. The new tunnel connects to the old sewers. The embankments are being raised and reinforced rather than replaced. The pumping stations are being upgraded but remain in their Victorian buildings. This continuity across centuries is remarkable, evidence that truly well-built infrastructure can adapt to circumstances its creators never anticipated. The workers who descended into the excavations in the 1860s could not have imagined the London of today. The city has grown beyond anything they might have conceived. Technologies they never dreamed of shape modern life. Yet the sewers they built with bricks and sweat still function, still serve the city, still prove their worth every day. This is their monument, and it is magnificent precisely because it is invisible, taken for granted, working so well that most Londoners never think about it. That invisibility is both triumph and challenge. The sewers work so well that we forget they exist, forget that they require maintenance and investment, forget that the health we enjoy depends on infrastructure hidden beneath our feet. This forgetting makes it harder to justify spending on upgrades and repairs, harder to maintain political support for unglamorous but essential work. How do you convince people to invest in something they never see and rarely think about? The Great Stink provided a powerful motivation, direct personal experience of the problem. But we cannot wait for such crises. We must learn to value infrastructure proactively, to recognize that maintenance and investment are not costs, but essential investments in our collective future. This requires a different kind of political leadership, one that can make the invisible visible, that can help citizens understand what they depend on and why it matters. Bazalgette sewers connect us not just to Victorian engineering, but to a way of thinking about cities and civilization. They embody the idea that we are all connected, that individual health depends on collective sanitation, that the actions of millions of separate households and businesses must be coordinated through shared infrastructure. They represent the understanding that cities are systems, complex and interconnected, where problems in one area eventually affect everyone. This systems thinking is more important than ever as cities grow larger and more complex. Modern London faces challenges Bazalgette never imagined, from electronic infrastructure to energy grids to communications networks. But the fundamental lesson remains: cities are collective projects requiring collective solutions. Individual initiative and market forces play important roles, but some challenges require government coordination and public investment. The Thames flows through the centre of this understanding. It is both nature and infrastructure, shaped by human hands but retaining its essential character as a river. It connects London to the sea and the wider world. It provides water, transportation, recreation and beauty. But it also receives the city's waste, tests the limits of our infrastructure, reminds us that nature cannot be completely controlled. The river is always there, patient and persistent, ready to fight back if we forget to treat it with respect. In the summer of 1858, the Thames fought back with smell, with a miasma so powerful it shut down government and emptied the streets. It won that battle, forcing London to change its behaviour, to invest in infrastructure, to respect the river's capacity. But it was not a total victory. The sewers tamed the Thames, reduced its power, constrained its flow. The relationship between city and river became one of managed coexistence rather than dominance by either party. This managed coexistence is perhaps the best outcome we can hope for in our relationship with nature. Complete domination is neither possible nor desirable. The Thames can still flood, still surprise us with its power. But complete wilderness is also incompatible with a city of millions. We must engineer solutions that work with nature rather than against it, that respect natural systems while also meeting human needs. Bazalgette sewers do this imperfectly but effectively. They intercept sewage before it reaches the river, but they discharge it downstream where tides can disperse it. They follow the natural slope of the land, using gravity rather than fighting it. They account for the tides and floods with pumping stations that can handle surge flows. They are, in their way, a partnership with the river rather than a conquest of it. As we face new environmental challenges, this approach of partnership rather than conquest may be our best hope. Climate change cannot be solved by fighting nature, but only by working with natural systems, by reducing emissions and adapting to changes we cannot prevent. Rivers cannot be completely controlled, but they can be managed through infrastructure that respects their power while protecting human communities. The Great Stink was a warning that nature will not accept unlimited abuse. The sewers were a response that, while imperfect, showed respect for natural limits. The river is cleaner today because we stopped treating it as an infinite sink for waste. This lesson applies to the atmosphere, the oceans, and all the natural systems we depend on. There are limits, and crossing them has consequences. London learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, through crisis and suffering. The city was lucky that the crisis came in a form that forced action before worse catastrophe struck. Other cities have not been so fortunate, facing floods or disease outbreaks that killed thousands before infrastructure was improved. We have the advantage of knowing this history, of understanding the consequences of inadequate infrastructure and environmental damage. The question is whether we will act on this knowledge before our own crises become catastrophic. Will we invest in infrastructure for climate adaptation before floods overwhelm our cities? Will we reduce emissions before warming becomes irreversible? Will we clean up pollution before ecosystems collapse? Or will we wait, as Victorian London waited, until the problem becomes so immediate and undeniable that action is forced upon us? The Great Stink suggests that we will probably wait. Human nature and political systems seem to require immediate crisis before taking expensive action. But the story also shows that when we do act, we can accomplish remarkable things. Bazalgette sewers seemed impossible until they were necessary, and then they became inevitable. Perhaps our response to climate change will follow a similar path, with crisis forcing action that creates infrastructure serving future generations. The Thames will still be there, flowing through London as it has for millennia, long after we are gone. It will carry our sewage or our treated water. It will flood our inadequate defences or flow safely within our embankments, depending on the choices we make today. The river is patient and has all the time in the world. We, in our brief moment on its banks, must decide what kind of relationship we want with this patient, powerful force of nature. In 1858, the Thames forced that decision. The smell was intolerable, the status quo unsustainable. London chose to act, to invest, to build infrastructure that would serve generations. That choice echoed down through the decades, creating the cleaner river and healthier city we enjoy today. Our choices will echo just as far. Future Londoners will live with the infrastructure we build or fail to build, will suffer from our inaction or benefit from our foresight. The great stink of London, that crisis of smell and sanitation, that moment when the river fought back, changed history. It forced the building of infrastructure that became a model for cities worldwide. It contributed to the development of public health as a government responsibility. It saved countless lives and made modern urban life possible, all because for a few months in the summer of 1858, the Thames made itself impossible to ignore, and London finally listened.